Morning, everyone. Just to give a reminder or summary of what's happening. Um, so this will be probably Tuesday. Whether I give a shiur on Tuesday or not, I'm not yet sure. But certainly the Tuesday learning hopefully will sort of finish this sub-sugya. I did not give out Mara Makomas for Kuf Chaf Vav Amud base, because it was enough really just to see Rashi and Tosfos. But I'm going to make references to various sources, and I'll put that on the group afterwards. I just didn't want people to focus on it now because it was just really just working through the Gemara with Rashi and Tosfos. But our aim is to get to the end of the Perek, and just going forward again, as I said, Tuesday probably will be a chance for people to finish learning the Gemara because we've rushed a little bit, and also I will add some sources then. But then going forward from that, Adam will let us know the exact timings, but I think the week after next probably we'll start with Rabbi Lawrence. I can't remember if I mentioned his name last time or not, but he's an incredible Talmud Chacham. Planning to give a shiur very similar in format and style to this, in which we're doing the Gemara Be'iyun with some lomdus, and then taking it into practical halacha. And I'm an exceptionally modest, wonderful person also, and I'm really, really delighted that we've managed to secure his services for the next few months. And I look forward to the chaburah, to rejoining the chaburah when on my return. Just briefly summarizing Chuf Chaf Vav Amud Aleph and the points we made. And I'm not going to go through everything again. I appreciate we're rushing through things, but if you listen to the recording, if anything was unclear, I hope it will become clear. We drew out those several themes which we will continue to look at on Chuf Chaf Vav Amud base. The first point is that Rashi basically learns that the sugya is a sugya of boina, and the simplest understanding of Rashi is that Rashi learns that all the way through. So Rashi says the issue is because of boina, and the discussion in the Gemara is what you need, to what degree do the two things that you're attaching to each other need already to be dedicated and specified to each other, such that we do not view this as boina, because it's like opening and closing a door. It's just they're part of one item, and even when they're detached, they always have that functionality there in them, and if I'm not creating a new functionality by attaching them, or to what degree are they significantly enough detached that when I put them together, I'm creating a new functionality by doing it. So for example, the pakak, if the pakak is completely detached, it's true that I may often use the same pakak to close the window and to open the window, to close the window and open the window. Nonetheless, perhaps I can't deem this like a door because it's not detached. It's two separate things, and each time I'm doing an act of boina. Each time I'm creating a new functionality by doing that. Maybe only boina drabonon because it's temporary. Maybe in some situations boina deraisa because it's permanent. But in principle, it's an act of boina because I'm joining and detaching things. Or no, do we say that if it's kosher, or even if it's hanging on the ground and so on, it's attached enough that this is the point. Isn't that it's attached and therefore it's not boina because it's hanging on a rope or something like that, but it's not in place. The point is, since it's hanging on the rope, it's deemed as simply opening and closing a door. I'm not creating a new entity, a new functionality, a new object by putting the two parts together. So that's Rashi's sugya. Tosfos basically learns that it's a sugya of tiltul. Interestingly, that conceptually there's somewhat of a link to it, because the question of whether it's Muktza or not, in some ways, is also determined by the same sort of question. If it's made, if it's specified and dedicated to its role of acting as a conner or a pakak or a bolt in a door, whatever it may be, then by definition it's not Muktza. And if I'm creating a new functionality by so doing, then it is Muktza because I'm doing something which, at the end of the day, the conner is just a stick. A stick is Muktza. The fact that I always use this conner as a bolt doesn't make it a KD, and therefore it would be Muktza. So conceptually, there's an overlap between the Tosfos reading of the sugya and Rashi's reading of the sugya, and that's not surprising because the Gemara is working with the same sort of concept. But nonetheless, basically, Tosfos learns that it's an issue of tiltul. And then we spoke last year about why would this be different to any other KD? And we spoke about the concept of it being tashmish binyan as opposed to tashmish bias. It's not a kli tashmish is not Muktza, but a tashmish bias is Muktza because when I have something which is just acting as a wall, is it really a KD? A KD is something I use. I'm using it for something. It's made for all hishtamshius. It's not Muktza because I use it for something. Something which does its role by just being, by ising. It just is that. It's a pakak. It's a wall. It's a kisoy. Is may not be a KD and therefore may be a higher degree of Muktza or more difficult for it to cease to be Muktza. And we discussed a little bit about the lomdus to do with that. And we looked at Tosas Divrei Maschil Bain and Tosas Divrei Maschil Vamunach briefly. We didn't go through them all. Tosas Divrei Maschil Rebbe, we Rabbi Huda, we didn't really get up to, but basically Tosas asks a stira between Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel and Chorios, which do not need kshira, and Naga, which does need kshira. And Tosfos answered that you need kashira because of binyan. So basically what comes out from that Tosfos is that even though Tosfos says the sugya is a sugya of Muktza, he also agrees there's a binyan element going on over here. And really the rest of it, you now have to work out the maths in Tosfos, how he combines these two things. But basically Tosfos learns there's a multi-tier sugya going on over here. There's two halachic concerns. There's a concern around Muktza and a concern around binyan. I didn't give you the source, and maybe I'll add it in, that there is a Ramban that says that chorios don't need kshira, because in truth, chorios are the chorios hadekel, the palm fronds that we learned in an earlier sugya, and reference later. And Tosfos says that chorios don't need kshira. The Ramban says chorios don't need kshira because fundamentally they are made for use. And the only problem is I've decided to use them for sreifa. I've decided to burn them. I've decided I don't want them. And then it's easier for them to switch back to becoming a useful entity. An interesting idea that sort of connects with the rest of Muktza, as opposed to the naga, which is it doesn't have another use other than acting as a bolt. And if it's not sufficient to be a kli in its role as a bolt, then without kashira, it doesn't. It remains Muktza. Okay, so just to summarize, really,
the biggest, the main, the Conair on Yom Tov is a category of something. It's the most Muktza thing in the world of Shabbat, but in the world of Yom Tov, because it's made for use, that's a classical example of something of the same object in a different world could be of use in Yom Tov and could be Muktza on Shabbat.
Yes, I'm not. You're right. I'm not going into this particularly just because I don't want us to get too caught up in Shabbos and Yom Tov. But yeah, there's many other interesting aspects in the sugya, including that. But all I really want to draw out from the sugya, because the maths of the sugya is quite difficult, but conceptually, really, there's a number of themes that emerge from the sugya, and that's really going to be my sole focus. Was my sole focus in the last year and will be my sole focus in the next in this year, in which we look at Amud Beis. From the learning of the sugya on a pshat level, really all we're looking at, because otherwise it becomes very overwhelming, is machlokas Rashi Tosfos, whether the dynamic at work in the sugya is bonet or Muktza. And the second major theme we're drawing out is that, and I'm really pleased we're managing to finish the period, just to, if for nothing else other than to bring out this theme, that not everything useful means it's not Muktza. So we're all along we've been talking about a keli. We keep on saying kelim are human slaves. They're there to serve me, and that's why there's the lomdus of a klisha melachot leheta. That leisa can still be omeid for tzorich guf, tzorich nekomo. The whole period we've been exploring this idea of a keli being a human slave. What comes out in this last daf is that not all things which are useful for humans mean they're not Muktza. You do have to think about in what way are they useful. And useful means I'm using them. If their use and their utility to me is simply that they are like a wall of a house, that wouldn't stop it being Muktza. Now, normally walls of houses is sort of, it's an irrelevant concept. It doesn't make a difference. It's part of a building. It's not that sort of thing which I'm metaltal at all. However, if I can have a wall which is metaltalable, that is grabbable and usable, then I have to start worrying that it's Muktza, even though it's useful for me, because it's useful doing the role of a wall. What's an example of that? Our sugya of Pekak and Kisoi, Bur, and these sorts of things. The lids of pits, I mentioned last time, picture, when you walk along the street, you sometimes see if the utility workers are digging holes in the ground, there's a plastic thing put on top of that. It's doing the functionality of a floor. A floor is a useful thing, or a Kisoi, but it doesn't make it a keli. So that's what's coming out in this last stuff. And not everything useful crosses the threshold of being a keli, and that's what we need to sort of worry about and think about. I'll give you a bit of an example of this idea, which is in machlokas haposkim about pets and whether pets are Muktza or not. Now, in classic halacha, animals are deemed Muktza. Why are animals deemed Muktza? I mean, they're useful things. The answer is, but they're not a keli. You don't use them in the same way as you use a keli. They're not something you take in your hands and use. So this was in classic halacha when there wasn't a concept of a pet. In ancient times, people didn't really have pets. You find references that maybe exceptionally wealthy people like kings had pets, but no one else had pets. Halacha doesn't really deal with pets at all. Enter the modern era, and the poskim debate what's with modern day pets. So modern day pets, like a dog or a cat. I'm not talking about a lizard or a goldfish, maybe, but a dog or a cat, you sort of use as a keli. You enjoy, the whole use of them is we enjoy taking them and putting them on our laps and cuddling them and stroking them, whatever. So they've sort of become a type of keli. So there are poskim who say, good, so they won't be Muktza nowadays because it's a keli. Other poskim argue and say, no, an animal isn't a keli. An animal is its own thing. It's too independent an object for it to be enslaved. Of course, we use animals, but it's not enslaved to human beings, that it doesn't become a pure utilitarian object, a pure utility, a keli, in which case and to argue that it isn't Muktza. It's true I use it, it's true I enjoy it, it's true I benefit from it, but it's not a keli. I can't say it's a utensil or an appliance. A keli is something that I use to do things for me that I couldn't do by myself. I want to cut something down, I have an axe to cut it down. I want to cook something, I have a pot. A keli is like an extension of a human's ability to function. A wall is giving me functionality, but not by my use, but by being. A pet I may enjoy, but it's not a functionality in that way that it should be deemed not Muktza for that case. This remains a conceptual machlokes about how you conceive of the concept of it. Again, I'm not trying to compare like with like. I'm just trying to give an example of this onwards. This stuff forces us to think a little bit more carefully about what we mean by use in that way. Yes.
But do we have to call that object a keli in order to make it not Muktza? Can't we call it, in the case of Masechet Shabbat was a classic example to go on to Imam Bet, but not, does there have to be, do we, I mean, the mathematics gave the example of the kanef of Yom Tov. Why can't we call something not a keli, but still not Muktza?
Okay, so when we say keli, we don't mean keli like in Hilchos Tum and Tara or something like that, but we do need that it's used by me. So chorius is used for all sorts of things. Chorius is used for sweeping. Chorius is used for yeshiva. We saw those uses. But when we come to something used just as a wall or as a pekak, as a shutter, or as a kisoi of a pit, that's where it. I don't want to get too obsessed by the word keli in the sense of in other areas of halacha it has to be a keli. There has to be something that I'm using. In that sense, it has to be a keli. Even tashmish, yeah, but the problem is tashmish also we don't think clearly enough about what that word means. Something that is useful by being isn't me using it in that sense, perhaps. You can argue. I'll just give you an example of this: a picture on a wall. So you could argue the picture is another example of something that just is, not something that I'm using. Or you could say we do use it by gazing at it. That's a type of use of the object, different conceptually to perhaps a wall or a kiss of a keli. Sorry, Shimmy, you
No, something related to pet, but not related.
Right, okay, fine. Okay, let's move on to Kuf Chafov on Basem because I just want to share some significant points. So Rashi at the top of Kuf Chafov on the base has a very, very disturbing reading of the Gemara, but this is Shittas Rashi. Rashi, by the way, is not saying this in necessarily in practical halacha, but he's saying this is the view of Rabbi Yochanan, of Omer Avasi Rabbi Yochanan. And he quotes the Mishna that we're going to learn later on in Amid, in which it says, Kisaya Kedim Shiesh Lahem Beis Achiza Nitolin B'Shabbos. And Rav Yehuda Bashina Rav Asi Rav Yechon V'Hishem Teres Keli Alim. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said the view of Rav Yechon. He says this is the view of Rabbi Yehuda Bashina Rav Asi. So a Kisoy Keli, which has a base achiza, it has a handle. So we learned examples of this right at the beginning of the Masechta. Shida Teiva Migdal. So you have a very large chest, which is what people used to use as cupboards in the olden days, in which clothes are piled up. And on top of that cupboard, that chest, you put a lid. In order for the lid not to be Muktza, you need a beis achiza, a handle. Okay, I get that, because it has to be usable and it has to be miyuchad for use. It can't just be a random plank that I'm putting on top of the chest. But also it has to have a vihush yeshel Torah's keli. It has to have a Torah's keli on it. Now, I would have thought that its functionality as a lid is a type of functionality, and therefore wouldn't be Muktza. So as Rashi know, what Rav Yehuda Bar Shila means over here is it has to anyway be a keli for some other reason, and then I can use it as a lid on my chest. But if it's only a keli, if it's only useful as a lid of a chest, then it's Muktza, even though it has a Beis Achiza, even though it has a handle to it. And this is a massive chiddush, and it's taking what we said much further. But there's no escaping from it. This is what Rashi holds in this view. Rashi holds, there's an Amora who holds that even a lid of a keli isn't sufficient to be a direct functionality, because it's only a second order functionality to stop something being Muktza. And that's truly remarkable. It's a useful lid, and yet it's not Muktza because it's not its own functionality. Yeah. It needs a Beis Achiza in order to give it a specific use as a lid. We'll come to exactly what the 2 points are adding, but it anyway has to be a kli in some other form. Yes. Maybe not if it's not miyuchad for that. We'll come to that. We'll get to that. Yeah. But all I'm doing is quoting Rashi so far. Now Tosfos already is bothered by this, right? Tosfos already asked, etc. He says, why on earth should you need another use since it has its own use, right? Why should you need another use? What's the point of another use? Now, there's a lot of confusion over this Rashi. I will give you the sources before next Shiur or next learning session at least. I didn't want to give them now because they're quite confusing. There is a stream of the Rishonim that I don't know if they had a different girsa in Rashi to us, but they learn that Rashi again here is learning that this is about boina. This isn't about other things. This is a sugya of boina, and therefore he says it has to be a complete kli in order to remove the issur of boina. In other words, as far as Muktza is concerned, of course it'd be enough that it's a lid. The problem is that I'm attaching this lid to something, and with that I'm doing melachas boina, and that's really what's going on in Rashi. This is a very troubling view, because it doesn't look like Rashi's talking about boina, because he talks about shiddur, teva, and bigdol, unless Rashi's talking about binyam b'kelim or something like that, or they had some other version and they thought Rashi was talking about another lid. But all I'm pointing out is that that Rashi is if we learn Rashi is talking about Muktza, it's very problematic. Why should secondary use of a lid as a lid not be sufficient for functionality for Muktza? And no, you need it to have its own functionality. And there could be a escape clause that what's really going on is boina, and this is again Rashi consistent. A very, very senior figure said this, the Rosh learned Pshat in Rashi like this, and I'll give you the Marim Megomus. But it's very difficult to read this into Rashi, unless somehow Rashi meant boina, or we had a different version of Rashi. Also, the Gemara compares it again to chorios, the palm fronds, and chorios adekel, there doesn't seem to be boina going on. It seems to be a classic of Muktza. So there's a lot of difficulties with this reading, but that's one attempt at answering Rashi. Sorry. No? Okay. So that's one attempt of answering Rashi, and there are other Rishonim that go like that. A second way of answering Rashi is that that we have to take Rashi on face value, and that Rashi held that secondary functionality, of course, is enough to stop something being Muktza in terms of allowing me to use it for its own use, but it wouldn't be enough to allow me to move it for no use, i.e. Michama L'Tel. Very, very interesting idea. In other words, Rashi held, I just want to bring this out. We've seen, so let me just try and contextualize this. We saw that a klisha malachtoi leheta is a keli. It's omeid for any hishtamshus. It's klisha malachtoi leheta. It's omeid for any hishtamshus, and therefore I can move it for use, or even use it for non-use, like just Michama L'Tel. If it will get damaged by being in the sun, I can move it into the shade. What's the heta of moving it into the shade? That's not a use of something. The answer is in some variant because it's not Muktza at all. Either because it's a klisha malachtoi heta, and therefore moving it from to stop it getting damaged is deemed a heta type use because I want to use it for future heta use, or because the whole concept doesn't make sense. It's not Muktza, therefore why shouldn't I be able to move it Michama L'Tel? A klisha malachtoi issa is allowed l'tzorech gufa l'tzorech makomo. That means to say I can't move it stam, because it's a klisha malachtoi issa, it's a utensil used for issa, so it's Muktza. However, I can move it l'tzorech gufa if I have a positive use for it. So a hammer is Muktza because it's used for nailing. However, if I wish to use it to crack a coconut, I can do so because it's a kli, and a kli is my slave. A slave is only made for any hishtamshus. So that's a kli shemalachtoi issa. However, michama l'tzel, I can't move it. I can't move it from sunlight to shade because it's not. It's a creature after this. It's Muktza. There are those, and again, I'll give the Maramok and the Magina Shlomo, one of the commentaries on Rashi, who suggest that Rashi's view over here is that even though I can use the lid for its own purpose, i.e., to cover a pot, since it isn't a keli, in other words, it doesn't carry its own functionality. It only facilitates the functionality of something else. I would not be allowed to move it mishlam l'tel. So here we have a second example of not all functionalities. You can't just assume, according to this strata of thought, that's because something is useful, that's enough to make it not be Muktza and be a keli. If something, as we saw, is a kisoy of a burr, it's not a keli because it's just a floor or a wall, a pakak of a chaloin. And if something, according to this opinion, Rabbi Yehuda bar Shilai, if something is facilitating something else's use but isn't useful in its own right, that would also leave it as Muktza. I can use it for the thing it's useful for, to cover a pot, but it isn't a keli in which I can say by default it's only made for any other use. The whole point of a keli is it's only made for any use because it's my slave to be used for anything. It's dedicated utensil. This isn't a utensil. It's not something that I use as a human being. I use it to facilitate the use of something else that would be included in Muktza. I'm repeating the words. To be honest, I struggle a bit with the svara. At the end of the day, it's useful for me. But Rashi in Rabbi Yehuda bar Shilai said, I have to think about in what way is it useful for me. If it's not directly useful, it's only useful in allowing me to use something else that isn't a sufficient usefulness to make it a keli. I'm repeating this of Rashi. I can't say I've fully internalized exactly what that means, but I can hear the sort of maths of what you're saying. That something that's useful for me is a keli, something that's useful to allow me to use something else is not a keli. And if I couldn't move it, mecham l'tel, a remarkable chiddush. But there's no getting away from it. This is black on white in Rashi. Rashi says that the kisoy of the shiddah, the teva, the big chest that I used to store my clothes in, is Muktza to some degree or other, unless it's anyway a keli.
Rashi previously with a kaner, you can when they go back to Yom, you can move it into the fire. So wouldn't that be consistent with what we just said?
But that's because it's only made for firewood.
Yeah, but in other words, you can't move.
Yes, sorry, yes, that is 100% right, yes. Firewood is another, thank you for bringing that to me. That firewood is another example of something like that, which is, it's useful, but not as a keli, because it's used for burning, and therefore I can move it for firewood, but not move it for anything else. It's a very, very similar concept. Thank you, yes. Yeah, yes.
Going to this, with the Mishna beforehand, the SheBeKiruya, as long as it can cover a barrel, surely covering is not considered a strong enough usefulness of the vessel to allow.
The answer is because it's SheBeKiruya. It was a keli, and all we need to do is stop it losing its keli status, and that's enough to stop it losing its keli status. Yes, that's exactly right. Very, very interesting. I will give you, by the way, some of this stuff really enters Halacha L'Maisa. I'm going to post B'li Neder in advance of next year, BR Halacha, that speaks about this. These are sort of fundamental halachic ideas. Very, very, very interesting.
Suggesting that a lid with a Beit Achiza onto the ground cover, that's effectively
yes, so for the ground cover, it would be perhaps boiner and certainly Muktza. But the chiddush of Rashi is even a pot cover, which I can cover without concerns. Not a pot cover. I'll tell you why not a pot cover later. But a chest cover, which I can. There's no melacha involved. It's not boiner in the least. I can certainly cover my chest with it, the box with it, because that's its need. But nonetheless, it's not a keli, and therefore it couldn't be used mecham l'tel. Nice analogy of Adam's.
Yes, it could still be a keli.
No, because the chest is not boiner. There's no melachot issa. And if it's a pit lid, then you're right. But if it's a chest lid, why on earth would that be? There's no melachot involved in it. So the Rosh went on your line of thought, and he seems to understand that Rashi is only talking about where there's boiner involved, either because of binyan b'kelim or because he had some different version. Rashi, I don't know what to make of it. So it's a very mysterious Rosh. The Rishonim will argue with Rashi, and they learn that's what's going on. The Sukkah, we're talking about binyan cases. But Rashi, as we have it, seems to be talking about kelim. And no one can believe Rashi means you can't use it as a lid. Of course you can. It's miyuchad to use as a lid, but it wouldn't be enough to make it a keli. And Adam gives a very nice analogy to firewood on Yom Tov, in which it's not muktzah in the sense that I can use it as firewood, because it's clearly muchon for that use. And it is muktzah in the sense that it's not a keli, because firewood's not a keli, and therefore I couldn't move it for anything else. Yeah. Okay, Tosfos, in contrast, learns that that Torah's Keli means that you need to be masakin it as a Torah's Keli. It needs a tikkun as a Torah's Keli. So you have this lid, and Rav Yehuda Bar Shiur says it's Muktza unless you were masakin it for Torah's Keli, unless you fixed it for Torah's Keli. What does it mean you fixed it for Torah's Keli? I mean, it is a Keli. It's got a handle on it. What other fixing is there that you need? So basically, there are two schools of thought over here. Either all he's adding is that you have that the putting of the handle is enough guffa to make it into a tikkun for Torah's Kli. So he doesn't really mean an extra condition, because by definition, when I fix it as a keli, that makes it into a kli. Or maybe he's talking about a case where it has a natural kli. It was born with a kli. In other words, I have a plank, and the plank has a warp to it, or a knot in the woods or something like that, and then it has a nice handle to hold on to it. And the point is, it's not enough that it has a handle by itself. It has to be where I've been sucking the handle for the purpose of it being a lid. So this is, again, this is just a good reading in Tosfos, and I'll give you a Halacha that discusses that. I'll just try. Is are people with me, or is this okay? So just to summarize, the top of the Omud is dealing with the weakness of lids in Hilchos Muktza because they're secondary uses. Rashi says it needs to have a completely separate use. It has to be a kli from some other reason, otherwise it would be Muktza, at least with respect to Chaman Etzel. Tosfos says, no, of course not true. As long as it's fixed to be a lid, that's enough. But at the end of the day, it's just a board. What makes a board into a lid? That it has a kli achiza, it has a handle to it. And number one. And number two, it has to be matukan lekli, it has to be masukan lekli, you have to have made it as a kli. What does that mean, make it as a kli? One way of understanding it is, for example, a naturally formed handle wouldn't be enough to make it as a kli. I have to have done something to dedicate this, to specify this, to take it out of being a plank and make it into a kli. The Gemara carries on, and I'll simply remind you of this because we discussed it in last year. The Gemara asks, and so on. I simply pointed out last time that this comparison to Chorya Shel Dekel is difficult. If our sugya is a sugya of boineh, then what's the comparison to Chorya Shel Dekel? There's no building being involved over there. Well, the answer we'd have to say is that here Rashi agrees that we're talking about Muktza. If the sugya is a sugya of Muktza, we also have a problem. Because Tosfos explains, why is there a heightened degree of Muktza over here? Because this is a tashmish bias. It's not something I use, it's just part of the house. Chorius is not part of the house. It's a use. I'm using it as a broom or something like that. It's a classic useful keli. So what exactly is the Gemara doing when it compares Chorius Shel Dekel to our sugya? Remains unanswered, remains a question that I'm not aware of a clear answer to this question. And I mentioned this last time.
So the Tashmish Bars, because I don't think we should spend that much on why is that more Muktza?
That's this svara that it's not using, it's ising. It's just a wall, it's a window, it's a floor. No, translation of Tashmit. Yes, translation of Tashmit by it is something I'm not using as a keli for Shtamshus. I'm using it. It just is. It's a pekak. A pekak is a wall. That's what it is. I've got a chalon and I'm blocking the chalon. A kisoi bar is a floor. I've just got a bit of floor. So that's not called a Shtamshus of usefulness. That's just being. That's a state of being. Okay, let's move on to the Mishnah, because really the Mishnah is already quoted in the Gemara at the top of the Amud, so we've already sort of started touching on this. The Mishnah says, Kol kisay kelim sheishem beis achiza nitolim b'Shabbos, and if they don't have a beis achiza, they can't be nitolim b'Shabbos. There's a reading problem in the Mishnah, and again, I'll post a biur halacha on this. Does the Gemara mean nitolim b'Shabbos? It can be used to cover, but not for anything else. In other words, it's also Chaman Etzel, or does the Gemara mean you can't even use it to cover? Now, why would you not even be able to use it to cover? Because of the continuation of the Gemara, that maybe there's various gezeros floating around about a binyan and getting confused to covering pits and so on. So I just mentioned that for when you learn the sugya, notice that it's a little unclear. I'll finally conclude with one final point, and with that we'll finish the sugya. At the end of the Gemara, the Gemara says that really what's going on over here is that everyone agrees that kisoi karka is a problem because of potentially boineh, and therefore you need to do something to make it clear that this is like a door that you're sort of opening and closing. It was always specified to kisoi karka. Otherwise, I'm joining something to the ground, and which would be boineh. Everyone agrees if you have a pure keli, like a pot, there wouldn't be a problem with putting a lid on it. And the whole machlokas is kelim which are mechuber lekarka. That's the first version of the Gemara. The second version of the Gemara is the whole machlokas is with kisoi tanur. Has people seen this Gemara? Is this familiar to people or not? Is anyone up to this? Okay, if you're not up to this, please, I'm speaking out to the recording when you listen to this. Hopefully, you'll understand this. The Mishnah, just to summarize outside, again, do not let this confuse you. I just want to explain a concept to you. There is a Mishnah that is cited at the top of the Omud, which says that kisoi of kelim needs a handle, and kisoi karkos, and then there's a machlokas whether this is only with kisoi karkos. In brief, covering a ground has a real problem of boineh. If I put a lid on a pit, there's a real problem of boineh. Covering pots shouldn't have a problem of boineh. So why would there be an issue of having a handle to the kisoi? And the Gemara answers that covering the ground is definitely a problem if it doesn't have a handle. Covering a regular pot or something like that is definitely not a problem. There's no binyan over there. Covering something which is mechuber lekarka, that would be a problem. That's version one in the Gemara. The Gemara then brings a second version that covering a tanur is where the machlokas is. Now, it's very unclear what the difference between the two versions are. In those days, a tanur used to be mechuber lekarka. So the Gemara, the second version is simply giving an example of the version of the first principle. The first principle says any keli which is mechuber lekarka is where the argument is. The second version says the argument is a tanur. A tanur is just an example of a keli that's mechuber the karka. And Rashi in the first version gives the very example of a tanur. He says, what's an example of a keli that's mechuber lekarka? A tanur. So it's exactly the same thing. And the one suggestion of an answer, very briefly, is there's a beautiful Ramban. And with this I will conclude because it's a really interesting concept. We've explained all along that the weakness of a lid is it's a secondary ishtamshus. All it is a cover of something else. Is that really true? Is it a secondary ishtamshus or not? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes not. With a tanur, the lid is just another wall of the oven. It's part of the primary purpose of the oven. An oven needs to be walled all the way through. For sake of convenience, 3 out of the 4 walls are fixed, and the 4th wall I open and close so I can get things into the oven. But the 4th wall is no less part of the keli than the other 3 walls. So in that case, says the Ramban, that's the example of this. Maybe this isn't even deemed a kisoi at all. Maybe the tanur isn't in the concept of a kisoi at all. And the second issue is even a tanur. So all I want to conclude with is, we've spent the Omuds discussing secondary functionality in the view of Rabbi Huda bar Shilai, that a lid is a secondary function, not a primary function. You have to be very nuanced and careful in the application of this. Sometimes a lid is simply an addition to something. You have a chest, and the lid is on top of the chest. Sometimes the lid is part of the core functionality, in which case don't deem it a lid, deem it as part of the core functionality. It's literally part of the tunnel. The door of an oven is as much part of the oven as all the other walls of the oven. It's just convenient to have a movable wall and a permanent wall. Okay, I will finish here. It makes it also better because it's not a secondary function.
But it is. But you're actually making a fully functioned oven.
It's true, but as long as it's not boineh, there wouldn't be a reason to say it's Muktza. It wouldn't be considered as a secondary function, and therefore if it's only for that, it wouldn't be Muktza. Okay, I will see if I can come on Tuesday. I'm not entirely yet sure of my timetable. If I can, then even if I don't give a full share, because I've sort of said everything once, I'm happy just to go over some of these ideas. I will send for Tuesday some of the sources we referenced. I think in terms of timing, it would be very nice if everyone could finish the sugya, I suppose, by next Sunday at the latest, with the sources. And if anything I've said is unclear, then just listen to the recording of this and hopefully it will become clear retroactively. And then Adam will offer further guidance about when we'll start the new sugya with Rabbi Lawrence. I don't know yet. Possibly, yes. Maybe. I'll see, but I will get back to everyone. And in the meantime, if I'm not here on Tuesday, I do wish everyone Hatzlacha Rabbah for the next sukkah that you will learn with Rabbi Lawrence. I think you're in for a treat, and I'm a little jealous of him actually. I'll be missing this chaburah, but I look forward to getting back to it when I'm on my return. So,
Thank you.
very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.